So wonderful to be here among friends, longtime friends, new friends of MacDowell. I'm Xanthi Scharff, and I'm so delighted to be here as a guest of the amazing MacDowell team. 𝗫𝗵𝗿, my longtime friend who introduced me to the organization, and to 𝗫𝗵𝗿, our brilliant leader of MacDowell in this chapter and bringing so much vibrancy to the organization, and the whole team that welcomed us here, Brett and Jean and everyone who's here. Really thrilled to be here for what I understand is a revitalization event in this space, and to talk about journalism and to be here with these brilliant women. I am the co-founder, and for 10 years was running the Fuller Project until recently. And this is also a Fuller Project partnership event. The Fuller Project is the global newsroom that's dedicated to reporting about women to catalyze positive change. And through my work at Fuller Project, I've gotten to know Jane and Zara over the years, first on paper, and then together through friends and through shared stories about journalism. So I'll give you a brief introduction to these incredible women, but you'll get to know them through their stories today, and their bios, of course, are online as well, which are illustrious. Zara, we first met actually after you had been reporting together with one of our editors at the time, 𝗫𝗵𝗿 𝗪𝗂𝗏, and you all were planning a long series reporting on Afghanistan throughout 2021. And in fact, before it could be published by Time magazine, Kabul fell, Taliban took over Kabul, and you immediately switched tacks and began reporting on the event in real time, including stories for Time, and you brought stories from dozens of women all over Afghanistan, new voices, new writers to the press, and at least 50 news organizations were calling, asking for access to the stories and the sources that you reported. You are also a PhD student focused on gender, and recently you've been named a Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan. There's much more we can say, but we'll get into more of that. Jane, my first memory of meeting you was through our good friend Morgan Till, the foreign editor at PBS NewsHour, who has so much appreciated working with you over the years. And in fact, it was your photo that I saw in, I think it was 2019. You were receiving an Emmy for your reporting on Inside Yemen. You and the photo was of you and Morgan and one of your local colleagues, Ahmed, I believe, who had come in from Yemen to receive that award, one of many that you won for that series and for your work, the national headliner, the DuPont, I can go on and on. You're known for some of the bravest reporting for gaining access in war zones to real people, whether they are fighters in the Free Syria Army or whether they are mothers who are struggling to survive, but always with a focus on the people and the humanity and the stories. Much more to your bio as well, but that is, I think it's enough for us to get started. So in the face of such incredibly talented, accomplished, and brave women, it may be intimidating for some of us to get to know you. So I just wanted to start with a little bit from your past. What was it, Zara, that first made you want to be a journalist?
First, I wanted to say with the introduction that Zanti made, I'm just like shrinking now. Oh my God, the audience will say like, she's gonna to say? You know, it's hard to stand up to that bio, but
well, you did it.
You are very kind. You are very kind, but you will get to know that I'm not such incredible as Zanti described.
No,
but
much more.
Yeah,
much more.
But I will try to tell you. When I was thinking about that question of my past and what made me become a journalist, it came to my mind that experience of living at the margin was, you know, one thing that very much have an effect in me eventually becoming a journalist. Particularly two experience was very much fundamental to how I became a journalist or why I became a journalist. One of those experiences was the first time the Taliban take over Afghanistan. My family fled to Iran, and then I was a very young child, around 6.5 years old, and didn't know anything about the world. We were living in a village in Bamiyan province, and we didn't have even electricity, TV, nothing. So basically, me discovering the life that there's so much cool things that I didn't know exist in the world. But one particular experience was that I wasn't able to go to school as an Afghan refugee. I remember my mom was taking me from school to school, asking and begging them they allow me to stay in a classroom and study, but they would say no because apparently we didn't have the document or whatever they wanted us to have. So growing up seeing that I didn't have the rights that every other children in my neighborhood had was very difficult, I was just seeing them. And beside that, there was experience of extreme racism that I was experiencing as an Afghan refugee in Iran. Even though I was speaking their own languages, I was speaking their accent, they would look at me and they would know that I'm an Afghan. So one experience in particular, which I haven't talked a lot about it, I have only once, I think, write it for a publication, but I think it's worth reflecting it here. And that was the experience that I remember one summer, because I wasn't going to school, so mostly I would go and do the shopping, I remember my mom asked to go buy something. I went to buy this, and I was coming back. There were some teenagers, our neighbors, were playing soccer that day, and one of them intentionally hit the ball in my right ears. And I remember it hurt so much, and it was numbed. I couldn't hear anything. So I cried and went home and told my mom that this had happened. And then because they were our neighbors, my mom took me to their door and asked them, like, why this had happened, especially the fact that they hit me intentionally. And then I remember the mother of that boy didn't say anything a lot, but their neighbors were there. And I remember that she told lots of hurtful things to my mother, because my mother was, the person who was, those things were directed. I think some of the things that I remember was that she told my mom, how dare you come to our door? This is Iran. I wish my son had hit your daughter so that I could throw your belonging on the streets. You nasty Afghani, go back to your country. And she said lots of hurtful things. And the point was that I was very hurt more than, like the feeling that I was being hit. It was this feeling that my mom is scorned because of me, and that made me become silent. So I never complained to my mom ever again after that experience. So when I went to Afghanistan, of course, it was one of my best experiences. I remember it was a Monday when we went to Afghanistan, and even though we were living in a suburb of Kabul, very poor neighborhood, no running water, no electricity at the time, and school was 1 hour away from where we were living. But I was so happy and joyful because I was able to go to school and feel like I am like everybody else, and I have a right to be here, nobody is gonna call me out. But again, the other experience was that being a woman in Afghanistan, and I was also coming from an so-called ethnic minority in Afghanistan, which was difficult to live with. So I remember one experience when I became a journalist. There was a lots of looking down, because when you're a woman, in my society it was that you're less. And many times, of course, I experienced this at home, where our relatives would pity my parents for having lots of girls. One was that when I was working as a journalist, I remember I think it was 2015, that one of my colleagues, who was actually running a big newsroom, he told me that in my face, we were actually sitting beside each other, our table was like close. You're never going to be a good journalist because you're a woman. And it hurt. And I said, like, why? Why would you say that? Because I want to become a good journalist. And he gave me 3 reasons. One of them was that you cannot stay late in office, you cannot cover an attack, and you cannot travel. And it was interesting, because up to that point, I was never asked to do any of those things. It was assumed that I could not do this. And I said, okay, I'm going to prove you wrong, that I can actually do these things. And when I joined the New York Times in 2016, which at the time they said I was their first Afghan woman journalist to work with them, I got chances that I didn't have. I could volunteer for the stories I wanted to do there. And I remember one of those stories that I did was, like, I was covering attack to say that there's nothing wrong with a woman who can go and cover an attack. I remember in 2016, there was an attack in American University in Kabul, so I went to cover that attack. And I met that colleague who told me that I could not, stay late and cover a tax. So I came to him and I showed my watch. They're like, it's 10 p.m., you're here, I'm here, And it felt good, it felt good to just say, and after that, there was many incidents, many experiences where I remember, during the, especially when I was covering attacks, first of all, the male journalists would say to each other, like, there is no man in the New York Times. Why they're sending a woman, okay. And I remember there was one police chief once, he was going to give us briefing. It was around 8 p.m. And then he said, before starting the briefing, he said, oh, sister, what are you doing here? I was like, oh, I'm a journalist. I should be here, And then he said, no, it's late. Why are you here? So basically, it was more about them thinking that my gender has something to do with what I can do or what I cannot do. But eventually, I think throughout my career, I proved that this is nothing wrong with my being a woman. It's about them and how they think. And those experiences made me powerful and made me want to become a journalist and tell the stories that others might not be able to tell. I'm going to end there. I'm so talkative, so you can guess.
I don't think anyone has ever been able to shut you up since then. You got this. Those are amazing stories, Zara, and it reminds me of a journalist who was working with us at the Fuller Project, and we asked her this question, and she said, I just hate bullies. And it's amazing how you have changed that experience into the power of standing for others. Jane, will you take us back into your past and spoiler alert, maybe one of the stories from your book, No Ordinary Assignment?
Sure.
But tell us one of your stories.
Well, thank you. Very, very hard act to follow. Your stories are extraordinary. Your life is extraordinary. But I grew up in rural Northern Ireland in the 1980s and 90s, which, doesn't compare to Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, but was a pretty patriarchal place. I didn't have a lot of female professional role models. So I wasn't entirely sure, I didn't really have in my life, I was a pretty working class background, a small farm, but I had huge wanderlust. I mean, I just basically stared at maps and atlases my whole childhood and National Geographics. And, but, I did have two things that really influenced me looking back in retrospect. The first one was that I was largely raised on the BBC. I would, in the evening, turn on the news and lo and behold, there would be women on the news, reading the news, reporting the news. Some of them, Moira Stewart was anchoring, but we also had Kate Adie and all sorts of, we had tons of foreign correspondents as well who were women. And they were off all over the world reporting. I had been told that adventurer was no longer a career choice come the sort of 1990s, but they were traveling and telling stories, and I absolutely loved that. And people were listening to them. They had a level of gravity and social import. So you'd look around the room, the living room filled with men who would normally wished women, or women would be serving tea and dinner, and everyone listened to these women. They had a certain command as storytellers and travelers, and I was mesmerized. The other thing that happened to me as a kid was I was growing up during an insurgency. We had a conflict, the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So we had, and I was in South Armagh, which was considered bandit country. I was in the very last sort of tiny Protestant village before you got to IRA heartlands. And so I was being raised in this community, which was pretty circumspect and this very tight-lipped Ulster Scots community where you just didn't really talk about the Troubles, but things would explode and people would get shot, but we didn't really talk too much about it. And it was deeply sectarian and divided, but off out in the hills out there was this insurgency, long before 9/11 and the post 9/11 conflicts that kind of swept across the Middle East. We in Northern Ireland had this sort of concept of rebels. What's a rebel? What's a terrorist? What's a bad man? What's a good man? man. And I was being raised in the society where you weren't allowed to ask questions, and I was absolutely fascinated. And I asked all sorts of questions that I wasn't supposed to ask, very publicly. And I think it's no coincidence that I ended up spending a ton of my career, most of my career, fascinated by insurgencies. What makes an otherwise normal, like civilian person commit acts of violence? A baker or a cab driver or a farmer, what causes people to rise up? And that, that curiosity mixed with the wanderlust to travel, just sort of, it became very obvious to me at a very young age that journalism was what I wanted to do, and I was very lucky to know that.
You wrote about a very memorable character, Fanny. I believe you dedicated the book to your aunt.
Yes.
And that she was an adventurer, that she told you stories when you were young about traveling the world, and that at a key moment when you were debating maybe settle down, start to live a more married, mortgage type of life, that she gave you one golden ticket to get out and do something fun, and you took it and you went to Yemen.
I did.
Yes, you did. And and I mentioned the story about Yemen at the beginning because in the book, when you talk about it, it's so clear that you have this deep love of humanity and deep desire to understand people and their conditions, and you went to great lengths and put yourself out really by yourself with the camera and not a lot of support at all to tell those stories. So could you just tell us a little more about how that experience shaped you as a journalist? You did something that other people were not doing. You created a new way of working as a one-woman show in some cases.
Well, 2 points that really kind of shaped who I was as a reporter. The first one, which was most glaringly obvious to me at the time, was that I was a terrible failure at trying to get a job. Like, no one wanted to hire me. Like, that's why. And people came to me, it's funny how people have viewed my career in retrospect, where they've been like, how did you know that, that the future was to be independent and learn how to do all these things by yourself and to go out there and just forge a new way of doing this? And I'd say, because I kept getting rejected for jobs. But I really didn't, there was nothing else I wanted to do. So, I didn't quit because there was nothing else I wanted to do. And so a lot of my book is the constant successes that sort of eventually came out of many failures. And so I was out there, obviously as a youngster, I thought I would grow up to be the chief foreign correspondent for a very prestigious network. I'd have a very glamorous life, a huge team, and it just didn't happen. I graduated college in 2007, financial crisis, which in the news industry had already begun. It was just, one thing on top of another. It was very hard for my graduating year to get any jobs. It was incredibly difficult. We really struggled, and many of us became those first young freelancers. And, in retrospect, it was a great blessing and taught us unbelievable field skills. Like, we had to move to these countries, which of course is what you should be doing anyway. We'd learn languages, we'd learn all the skills, we had to have great connections because we didn't have producers doing these things for us. And it made us stronger and smarter and better reporters. But to your point about, finding something that really resonated with me in my reporting, which was about the human impact of war. What's it like to actually live through war? That came along, and largely in Yemen, because I'd spent many years as a young reporter with these romantic, sort of silly notions of being a combat reporter and how cool it would be to cover bang bang and war. But it became really apparent to me in Yemen, I kept getting really pissed off because everybody kept reporting on the casualty figures from the actual front line, which, were grossly, smaller than they should have been. I mean, they weren't really updated very much. But they were something like 15,000, 16,000, 17,000. And then you would go to hospitals where thousands of people were dying from diseases that the country never had until the war began. Eventually it became clear that hundreds of thousands of people, many of them on 5 years and younger, so mostly the young children were dying from preventable diseases and malnutrition and starvation. And none of this actually gets chalked up as war reporting. but it is war reporting, and it would just frustrate me that, you know, that the public were very unaware of the actual humanitarian impact of war, and those are the real casualties in terms of the proportion of people impacted.
If I may take your job.
Please, absolutely.
So I wanted to know more about like how would you go about creating relationship with the people on the ground, because I was on the other side of that, so I'm very keen to learn like how you would approach that, you know, especially with the journalists, the local journalists who are working in these countries. It would be lovely to hear how you would do it.
It really is the local journalists, like especially when I was working in the early days in Yemen, you know, I mean, I would be working collaboratively with local reporters. Like, so say someone is a cameraman for Reuters, you know, they're very rarely like full-time staff. They might be on a loose string contract. So they would be able to come and work with me on certain days. And I could like hire them on a day-to-day basis. And we would basically share contacts, you know, like if a network needed a camera person, I would recommend them. And when they were free, they would work with me. Also, a lot of local print reporters would also just be able to really collaborate. Like, for instance, if I've got a driver and I know I can get up to that refugee camp, then we could split the costs. You know, or they could come for free, but they might have a good contact at the entrance. And so very often, if you're not competing, you're extremely complementary, you know, whether or not it's budget, resources, or connections, if you form a team. And it was the same during the campaign against ISIS in Mosul. So very much so, like a very combat kind of assignment, a hugely intense urban warfare situation. You know, like I would negotiate with the Iraqis for access, and then there might be like a local journalist working for Reuters who might come along with us, and we would basically team up and just not get in each other's way. And we'd also be a security watching each other's back. I always found wherever I was that the vast majority of the journalists who were around were locals, and so we just worked with one another as best we could.
How many languages do you speak now?
Only Arabic. I mean, I can like make small conversation in Dari, but like I don't really speak it. So yeah.
Thank you.
So Zara, let's talk more about local journalists. As I mentioned in your introduction, one of the things that was so remarkable to me at the moment when Kabul fell is that you had a network all around the country of women who wanted to tell their stories, and you figured out how to bring those stories out to press at a moment when Afghan women's voices were not sufficiently in first person in the news narratives. And I know this wasn't easy. I know it's not easy to break into international press. One of the things you heard Zara say, but I'll go back and underscore it for you, is that she was told that she was the first Afghan woman reporting for the New York Times in 2016. So many years after the US went into Afghanistan, in part under the mission of liberating and supporting Afghan women, 2016. So it just screams into relief for me how difficult it has been to get your voice, and then not only yourself, but to pull along dozens of other women's voices. But the question I want to ask you is, how did you do it? How do you do it? How have you built a newsroom that is purely fueled by Afghan women reporters who are in Afghanistan? To take us through the whole nuts and bolts. What does the newsroom look like? How many people are there? How do you verify stories? We want to know everything that you can share about how you've built this model for reporting in a silenced society in the middle of gender apartheid.
Thank you so much for that question. I'm going to go back to what you were saying, that, you know, initially when I started doing that, I have lots of contact in the country. But I would say what I was good at was, like, I already had experience at kind of remote reporting. Because even when I was in Afghanistan, working with either local media in Afghanistan or my last job with the New York Times, most of the stories I would say I've worked were the stories that I covered remotely, meaning that I was in the office, I would call, I would make connection, I would talk to the people, and I would interview them over the phone. So I felt that that was something, because in most of the provinces I would work, the security was not good. It was not possible. I remember one time we did a story in 𝗏 province about violence against women, and there were several women who were stoned to death in that province. We wanted to go there. We arranged everything, but unfortunately it didn't ended up, so we could not go. There was some security issues. We ended up doing the story remotely. I interviewed people over the phone, and we also worked with some local journalists who were there. So we're able to tell the story. So I was coming from that experience. I remember when August happened, I was working with Fuller Project with the story of like, what Afghan women would lose if the Taliban, what they fear to lose if the Taliban take over. By the time we finished the story, the Taliban had already taken over, so we didn't run that story, and instead we did another story on what women have lost, or lose now under the Taliban. So we were able to speak with many women. And at the time, I was also working with another Afghan woman-led media, 𝗭𝗵𝗿 Media, in Afghanistan, supporting them. So I kind of had a clear idea of what was going on and what was to come. So that helped me. When I started Zan Times, we launched our website in August 2022. I had a clear idea of what is the environment and where are we going, So I didn't had any assumption about that, things are good now and it's gonna stay this good. Because initially journalists were allowed to go inside Afghanistan, they were allowed to report, and apparently schools were not banned from the day one. And so it was relative freedom in early days compared to who the Taliban are. And I remember some of my colleagues when I told them about the method that we will be doing, and this was centered on how are we going to protect our journalists, the one that are working inside Afghanistan, how are we going to support them? And I remember some of my colleagues say you're paranoid, all the things that you're talking about security, it seems that as if you're operating Hezbollah or something, you take yourself very serious, no. Don't make assumption, I know what's coming. So for us, it's better to be ready. And then, things come and we are talking about people's lives. And if something happens, it's on me. And the other thing was that I was a journalist. So I was just thinking about journalists. My mind was working as a mind of a journalist. And I was constantly thinking that if I was on the ground, what would I wanted my boss to do, or, how to protect me? And I was constantly even asking them and talking with them and thinking how do you think we can protect you? What works and what not works? And we were constantly having this conversation with them. But I remember we ended up deciding that when we are going to do this, we are going to not use any real name. Not for the people who are working with us, the journalists, and not also the people who are inside the country. And then one of the decisions we made was that initially when I was working with other media, we had the kind of chat groups or WhatsApp group where all of our journalists, all of our team were actually in the group, and we were sharing their stories, ideas, and we were talking in that group. I didn't start such a group saying that I don't want my colleague inside Afghanistan to know each other, because that's a threat. If one of our team members is arrested, so if they know who their colleagues in Afghanistan are under the Taliban torture, it's very easy for them to, to expose their colleagues. So we decided to not have them know each other. And we told them that we only want you to let your emergency contact know that you're working for us. Nobody else should know about who you're working for us. This is a risk because of the topics we cover. So basically, I go a little bit back because I forget to tell you about why did we create Zan Times. Because I was a journalist in Afghanistan and coming from all this experience, I really felt hurt. First of all, that everybody I knew was in Afghanistan. They were constantly messaging me and telling me about what was happening, and I was fearful. There was a lots of pain, a lots of trauma and suffering for me, and there was many days that I have cried a lot. But at the end of those crying days, I was constantly asking myself, what can I do, to help? Because it was kind of guilt in my gut of okay, you're safe, but what about the people who are left behind? And then I ended up thinking, I'm a journalist, I can tell stories. But I felt that if I only do freelance or work for other media, I'm not able to tell the stories I want to tell with the emergency and also the urgency that I want to tell these stories. I was not able to do so. And then I decided to, let's go create a media organization. I started talking with my friends and colleagues and asked them are you in? And most of them is yes, yes. So I had a little bit student saving, which I wanted to build my house in Afghanistan, but since the Taliban came, of course, it was not possible. So I said, let's use this money for our website and for our colleagues who are going to work inside Afghanistan. We're going to pay them, and for the rest of us, let's do it freelance. Let's do it volunteer, and once, if our work is good, I'm sure there are going to be people who are going to come and support us. But first, we have to prove that we are capable of doing this work. And I just didn't know what it takes to do this work. I just wanted to write stories. And then I created this organization, and oh, there's something called finance. there is something called HR, and you're supposed to do something about this. You're supposed to have policies and all this. I'm like, I don't know how to do it. What should I do this now? So there was lots of days that I would say clearly here that I regretted my decision. What did I do with myself? Sometimes I was working, I'm sure Jen can relate to this. Sometimes I was working 16, 18 hours a day, no weekends, all working. My son was complaining, Mom, what are you doing? I'm not seeing you, And it was very difficult initially when we started. But I would say the good point was that the idea was, Zan means woman in Afghanistan, Z-A-N. So Zan Times was about the idea of at a time that the Taliban is repressing us, when the Taliban don't allow women, strip them of their basic human rights, we are here to be their voices. We want to be here, we want to tell our own stories, and also the stories of women who are inside the country. And for some of my colleagues, when I speak with them, they told me, about the security. Initially, I was telling them, the security is not good, and that I cannot protect you. I am here, and you're in the country. I'm not in a position to do anything for you if, God forbid, then you're arrested or something. I remember one of them told me, the security is bad, the situation is bad, but I need a purpose for my life. And if I can tell these stories, that becomes the purpose of my life, where I know that even if I am arrested, I'm arrested for something that means so much to me, that I'm the voice of the people in my community, the women in my community, and I can live with that, knowing that I have been arrested for something that matters to me. That's the purpose of my life. And that was something that I always think about, that Zan Times is the purpose of our lives, for us to know that we are, doing our part. We are delivering on our responsibility as a journalist, especially at this difficult time. And and then this August is going to be 2 years that we are surviving.
Congratulations. So it's customary at any panel at the end to turn to the panelists and say, what can we do to help? But I actually know some of the answer because we've talked about this many times. So I'm just going to tell you that Zara Nader is the real deal. She has been reporting and wringing out every ounce of energy, passion, and emotion into this project for years now. And it is very difficult as a small nonprofit, or a nonprofit that represents women overseas, any group outside of the US, to be honest. And there can be reluctance to come in and to fund a new organization, despite the obvious talent, credentials, bravery, and absolute necessity of that newsroom's mission. So the way that people can help a newsroom like Zara's, where the women are literally laying their lives on the line to tell the stories that have fallen out of the news headlines, to preserve the future and the potential of their country, is to donate to that organization. It is the single most important thing that can happen, so that those women are not volunteering in addition to everything that they're giving up in order to tell those stories. They really need the funding. And I'll say it's hard in journalism to raise money. It's hard to raise money for causes that are not mainstream. It's hard when it's new, but the money goes so far. The money goes so far. Even project funding, even smaller amounts of funding, bigger amounts of funding that are unrestricted are far better. So
I just want to add to that is that, it's always not about, the money itself. We have people who are committing $5, $10 a month. But most of the time when I look at that, more than the money itself, it's kind of giving me a hope that, look, this person doesn't know me.
Yeah.
But they care about my work. They want me to continue. And I feel that's the kind of hope that, like even in the days that I'm down, I'm just feeling that there are people who care about us. There are people who want us to continue, so we should not give up, and we should continue.
We should not give up. We care about you, and we need you. We need you. We need these stories to continue. And if you look at Zan Times, which I hope you will, you'll see such a breadth of storytelling, opinion writing, such a breadth of voices inside the country, outside the country, and you'll read about the state of affairs for Afghan women refugees in Iran. You'll read Zara's investigation together with Fuller Project, which was almost a year in the making, going to over a third of the different provinces in Afghanistan to record the rate of female suicide, which has now surpassed the male rate of suicide. It's typically the norm around the world that more men are committing suicide, but this has completely changed in Afghanistan. And these stories need to be recorded and told, especially at a moment when much of the world has thrown up their hands at the situation in Afghanistan. So, Jane, I'm going to come to you because I know you are fully with us in this conversation, and that you've been on the ground. You were in Kabul the same day in the Hotel Baron reporting on the fall of Kabul. You chose to stay and report that story. Tell me about how these experiences have informed what you're doing now as far as looking at new business models to support local reporters.
Thank you. I'm so fascinated hearing, what Zara's working with. I mean, I've become a little bit obsessed recently in a healthy way with how to fix a lot of the problems that are bigger problems in journalism that are not just subject to foreign correspondency and local reporters around the world as well, but also to how do we preserve journalism at a time when journalistic institutions are in decline and may die. And so I took a bit of time off, and I wrote my book, and then I took some time off to teach at university. And while I was there, really took some time to think and talk to people with much bigger brains than me.
Unlikely.
It was Princeton, so they're big brains. And so what I'm really excited by, and it's the first time in years, I've spent my entire career in an industry that's gone from crisis to crisis and has constantly been in decline. I'm very excited by what technology can do, essentially to get journalists paid. Because that's really, there's a huge demand for what journalists do. If you just look on social media, look at journalists' social media, following. If you look at Gaza right now, or Israel, or Ukraine, I mean, there are reporters with millions of followers, and many of them with hundreds of thousands of followers. So there's a demand for their work. The issues that we're seeing now is there a demand for news brands, for the way we've been doing it? And so, I've been looking at sort of disintermediating news, and also essentially creating monetization platforms for reporters, and so there's no reason why, we know that young people, especially if you're looking at Gen Zs and millennials, so anyone up to 40 in the United States, 60% of them already pay for or donate to news in some form. But the rub is that many of them are actually interested in paying for specific journalists. So they might be interested in Zara's work, and they want to subscribe to that. So that's really what I've been looking at. And I do think, a way to simply get journalists paid is the way forward. And technology offers some of the answer. You mentioned the fall of Kabul. I remember standing outside the right at the gates of the airport, and it's just dystopian. I mean, huge crowds of people, terrified and just awful. Masses of soldiers, American military and other and from elsewhere. It's just really a total crisis. And as fate would have it, very, very few journalists there. No American broadcasters other than the PBS team, and it was partly because people got stuck at the airport or got stuck inside the city, and then they weren't able to get here, and others had evacuated. And I just start filming on my phone, just scenes, and I upload them on Instagram. And I remember Anderson Cooper's show on CNN just started airing it. And I was like, hey, you can't use my footage. And so, and so it was a little back and forth, and I like him, and he's a brilliant reporter, but it was so interesting to me because in that moment with a phone, I was a one-person news agency standing there, and that really is all the difference. And you know, eventually we agreed that they could use the footage if they credited us and things like that. But that was really kind of an inflection point for me, where I started thinking about the right person in the right place, and 99% of the time that's a local journalist. And 99% of the time, the local journalist is getting paid a fraction of what the foreign correspondent is getting paid. And so what technology can do for people like Zara and her colleagues is really exciting. Yes. So for once in my career, I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I can see that. But I'm going to call you out on using a big fat Princeton word with us.
Okay.
Disintermediation.
Yeah.
Break it down.
I spent too much time in San Francisco last month. So essentially, you know, cutting out the middleman. Yeah. I mean, that's all that it is, you know. Like if someone is willing to pay Zara for her work directly and says, look, you know, I will give you $5 a month, and maybe 3,000 of my close friends and family might do that too. But we want updates from you. We're used to now with social media getting slightly closer to reporters. We want to see what their life is like and behind the scenes. And here we are on the road, and you know, here's some outtakes from the interview. And a lot of young consumers are used to that, you know, and the less formal work as well as the traditional formal news. So that's really all that it means. It means that, you know, we don't necessarily need a news organization. We just need an audience that's willing to pay for it and a journalist who can reach them.
Yeah. But do you think Facebook and Google will be okay?
I think they are, and these are words that could come back to bite me, but they are...
Go on.
They're not, they haven't, you know, obviously there's been this incredibly turbulent relationship between the big, you know, social media companies and journalists and journalism and journalistic institutions. I think it's a missed opportunity. I think that what we're seeing right now is that social media outlets are wonderful ways for journalists to connect with audiences, but not really very good places for you to hang your hat on professionally. It's extremely risky to have your entire career hinge on some Twitter followers who you actually don't own. You don't know any of their email addresses. If someone was to pull the plug on you tonight, you know, that's it. So that's a real risk. And also your ability to monetize that without giving too much to the middleman is the key. So that's where we got to look into.
Well, yeah, keep us updated. I'm sure great things are coming because you really know what it's like, and there could be no better ambassador for that cause. I will bring it back to the audience in a moment, but I want to say it's particularly exciting to be here with you tonight because we are also thrilled to know about the Journalism is Art program that MacDowell is launching, which is really an embrace of their past work with journalism, but also opens the door to so many different ways to support journalism. And for us, you know, in fact, journalism and art and other mediums, we have some of the same struggles. You know, the funding and frankly the survival of the creator is something that really bonds those communities together. And you hear what it takes, and you know there are lots of artists in this audience. You know what it takes. It takes bravery to put yourself out on the front line, to expose yourself, to share your art, to write a memoir, to show so much of yourself to the world because you care so deeply about a better outcome. So I'm very grateful to MacDowell to step so forcefully into the space of supporting journalists. And I know they're building that program and seeking partners. I have no doubt that it will continue to grow and that many more of the greats will walk through the MacDowell doors, both in person and virtually in the coming years. So we're thrilled to be a part of that tonight. I think while I encourage people to think of their questions, one thing that MacDowell might be interested to hear from us is just that. You know, she knows that the world is changing. It's one of the things that I think is so exciting about her leadership is thinking about we are changing, the digital world is changing, access is changing, artist needs may be changing. What do we need to know about how organizations can meet their needs today? So I'll ask a question of each of you while we warm up the crowd, which is, if you could give some advice to an institution that's supporting journalists or supporting artists, consider yourself among them, what would you say is most important? What do we need the most to support our survival and to support us in thriving in the creation of this information and knowledge and all the heart that's needed to come to the work. I put you on the spot.
Please take it.
One small thing I would say, you know, and I've been fortunate enough to work with not-for-profit news for years, and working at PBS, those were the best years of my career. I think part of the issue, one of them, you know, looking back, one of them, you know, I did these extraordinary trips, and when we could get the funding together for them, it was extraordinary. It was wonderful. We'd go on the road and we'd do great work. I think part of the difficulty was trying to make it more of a regular thing. You know, like when you're self-employed artist, writer, journalist, you know, you have these extraordinary highs and lows. So it's trying to somehow mitigate that feast and famine lifestyle, which can be quite stressful, that makes it difficult to sort of switch off between assignments. You know, I mean, I've always been on thinking about the next thing. And so I think any way that you can go to where, you know, a person who is lucky enough to be granted funding for their work, if they could feel like they had a longer term collaboration, that can have a huge impact on your life.
So I remember a funny story that I want to tell, but my point is that the creators need to know more about the finance, I think, because so first, from the culture that I come from, we don't really talk about money, you know. It's just like, you just don't take money, you know. That's how we are reacting to it. I remember one time I was invited to speak about, but I'm not going to name, you know, it was not an organization, but it was just, if I say it, people would know. But very big place invited me to come and give them a presentation. And I said, okay. And part of this is most of the time they would, you know, the people who invite you, they would pay for your travel and everything. So it never occurred to me to actually ask them, like, would you pay for me to come? Because you invited me to come and give you a presentation, you know? I purchased my ticket. It was in Canada. I purchased my ticket. I went there. I stayed the night at the hotel because the morning I was giving presentation. I couldn't make it that day, so I had to go and arrive a night before that. So it cost me around $1,000 to go there. I took almost 2 days off from the work, and I didn't hear anything back. It was like, oh, the presentation was great. Thank you very much. We learned a lot. Good job for you, and that was it. So I'm just waiting here and waiting that when they will let me know that I have to invoice them or something. It didn't come true. So eventually I built the carriage. It took me a while, maybe 6-8 months. Yeah. To build that carriage and actually ask them, like, I remember I came there, I paid for my ticket and everything, but like, you didn't reimburse me. And then they said, oh, did we approve that? I said, I don't know whether you approved it or not, but I was invited there, you know. And then they said, oh, the person who invited you, he forget to, you know, let the office know and everything. And now it's like a paperwork and everything. So the presentation was January last year, and I'm yet to get paid for it. So, and now I think that's the most point that I feel every creator, every artist, journalist have to know more about the finance and also build the courage of asking and negotiating.
And I think that's also one way that artists can support one another. You know, like you know, if you've done a speaking engagement and you know you're because you really, every penny matters whenever you're working and you're trying to supplement your income with speaking events and things. You know, you might not know how much to ask for. You know, like other people could have done that event and been very well paid, and it's a big thing for women in the workplace more broadly. Like letting each other know what budgets are, what people are getting paid, and what you should expect. Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that, like, if someone had come to you and said, you know, you should get it, you know, make sure that you agree with them beforehand, and like, you know, that's something that we can all be supportive of one another about.
Yeah, I just wanted, now I remember another story about this one. I think getting mentor is very good, and if the program help, you know, bringing people together who are senior, who have done that work, that really helped. For my, you know, personally, for me, it mattered. And I remember when I was talking about this experience with my mentor, and I told her, you know, like, this is the problem I'm facing. I don't know how to do it. And then she was encouraging me that you have to actually go and ask for money. And then she told me one experience of her friend. She said my friend is an LGBTQ activist, and apparently a big organization invited her to come to speak. And then they asked her, like, how much is your fees? And she didn't know how to put, like how much to put. So she put 150. And then they come back to her, it's like, 150 is a lot for us. Can you consider in decreasing that? And she said, like, okay, like how much you gonna pay? They were thinking, like, they wrote to her that $150,000 is a lot for us. And can you consider decreasing that? And it's like, oh, but I just meant $150. So they ended up getting $5,000 or something, but I was like, that's the, as you said, like, we have to know, like, where are we at this space and how much can we ask? So those are, I think, some of the things that if they can learn in a program, I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. I mean, it's funny, but it's also not funny. And I do think, and I've seen this over the years, and is that the people who we most want to hear from, because they actually have access to and have been on the ground and know the things and know the stories and have lived the stories, may be getting paid the least, or very often are. And so, I think that's the work of all of us to make sure that this person doesn't have to ask, that, like you told the story of the wonderful directors of the Wallace Night program who reached out to you. So you didn't have to ask yourself, should I apply or could I balance the work? They reached out and told you, yes, you could and you should. And I think we need more people with that sensibility. And thank you, MacDowell, for flying us in. So I'm sure you all have questions, because I know this is a curious bunch. And I see a couple of friends here, so I know they're holding back for other people to ask questions, but I can only hold them back for so long. Okay, in the back. Let's take a couple.
Hi, good evening, and thank you so much. So I'm a former diplomat. I was actually in Afghanistan, and so I appreciate your work all the more. Speaking of Afghanistan, and maybe this applies in other places, there's a narrative about how the country is peaceful. And it's a pretty evil narrative. It has nothing to do with the reality for, more than half the population. What do you think are the ways as a journalist that you can change language like that? Knowing that predominant narrative, are there sort of assertive ways to put some other words into play that would tell more of the story? Thanks.
Thank you. If there's another burning question, we'll take a couple. Just we want to hear as much from you all as we can with the time we have. If anyone has anything burning, go ahead. Yeah.
I would just link it to.
Thank you.
Sorry. So linking to Annie's question, there is, and I think you said this, the sort of like ennui, people throwing up their hands on Afghanistan and women's rights. So building on that, what are some of the arguments that sort of you put forward to say, actually, there are things we can do, this is what we could be doing? So for those of us who are still having these conversations with policymakers every day, what would you want us to be saying?
Those are two perfect parts to a question. The language that you all can use as journalists, and what can other people do? Are there policy things to do? Are there other things that need to be done?
That was a very good question, because I felt here was not a space to talk about it, but since you raised it, I think that's a very good question. And I feel that environment is mostly here in the US, where the government is trying to push this narrative that, the Taliban is our partner, and let's find a way to work with them. Let's find a way to engage with them. And most of the time, it really pissed me off. I'm just thinking, like, what the hell, The Taliban are literally saying women are not human, and you are thinking about ways to engage with them, and they're your partner. So there are a lot of contradiction with that strategy. And one of the things that I would very much connect with the second question is the idea of that some of the people, some of the voices come to dominate the space. So, and those people are often the people who would say what we want them to say. And unfortunately, I find most of, some Afghan activist politician who would come and make that argument that, Taliban are the peaceful, the only solution for Afghanistan. They are the possibility for peace building and things like that. And I just cannot turn my head around about this, what are you talking about? Because I know from the fact on what's happening on the ground that this is not the reality. But unfortunately, in these spaces, these women, these people are getting the spaces to talk, and then they would come back to you and say, this is what these Afghans are saying. Look, they want engagement with the Taliban. So what if we send the Taliban 40 million a week? That's what these people want, and that goes to make this narrative of who is saying what. But I remember there was one panel or one online workshop about women's rights, and especially about women journalists. And I was expecting to be speaking at that place because I say, okay, I'm a journalist, I'm working with women journalists in Afghanistan, and instead I was only given 2 minutes to talk, and specifically only talk about your organization, don't talk anything else. And I said, okay, and then I'm listening to this almost 2 hours of program, organized of course by the US government, and ended up so many men are coming here and everybody's talking about how things are good, how they're making a change. All of them say, oh, I have 50 women working for me, and then I got this project, and there's all online courses, there's this and there's that. And I'm just wait a minute. At the end I said, excuse me, from what I'm hearing here, a democracy is going on in Afghanistan. I am the liar here and trying to say there's a gender apartheid is happening. This is not based on truth. This is what you want to hear. And if that's what you want to hear, go with that. That's your narrative. That's your choice. But as a journalist, I have a responsibility to tell you that this is not true. The fact of what's happening in Afghanistan is no woman is allowed to step out of her house. She cannot work. She cannot get an education. And what kind of human are we when we don't have basic human rights? Even the possibility to choose our own clothes. So what kind of human are we? And then you're talking here about how things are good in Afghanistan. I just feel so disappointed, and most of the time I just feel I don't want to go to any of these places where they don't want to hear the reality. They want to hear what they want me to say, and I'm not going to say that because I feel I have a responsibility as a journalist, and that is to tell the truth, and the truth is not what they want to hear.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're facing as well, and that frustration comes from unfortunately, the situation for women in Afghanistan, which I guess in retrospect has been the case since the get-go with the U.S. government, but there is sort of a sense that we don't want to acknowledge what a disaster this is. We don't want to say it out loud, and so if we can kind of somehow fudge it, which is very frustrating. I just one small thing I would say in terms of how do you report on what is violence and what is not, what's peaceful. The extraordinary injustices that you describe, which are every single day life for women in Afghanistan, have happened in many countries at peace over the years. Not so much against women, but if you look at apartheid South Africa, or the Deep South in America, before the civil rights. And if we look, there are extraordinary examples around the world and throughout history of human suffering, of discrimination, of incredible human rights violations that happen in countries that are technically at peace. Whether or not a nation is experiencing a war doesn't necessarily reflect the quality of the lives of the people in that country. And so as a reporter, I would say we need to get away from this sort of 30,000-foot view of, and the approach should be, as you and your organization do, which is to zone in on what individual lives are like. And so it's individual experiences that matter the most.
Yeah. And I'll just call out an elephant in the room, which is that this is also a panel to talk about women and talk about the reporting that women do. And though we haven't led with that, because I think there's no need, we're talking about just the most talented journalists out there. But there is a contribution that's being made by women journalists. And Jane, you have a really brilliant TED Talk about this, which also made me laugh at certain points. These questions about why are there so few journalists, and then you tell them actually there are many, and they say, well, why are there so many women journalists? But as you argued in your talk really brilliantly, there are more and more women journalists, and these women journalists are leading the way in many cases and telling stories that we need to hear, and going out and telling the human story and bringing more nuance to the story. And things are changing. I will say, having led Fuller Project for 10 years, in the beginning, it was hard to even get people to understand that there was an issue with women being left off the page. When we started Fuller Project, it was 1 in 4 of the people that you read, hear, and see in news, 1 in 4 who are women. Then that same survey was done 7 years later, and it was the exact same. So there is still an issue, but we have advanced, and people are aware of the issue, and people are listening, and women are telling those stories. That being said, there is still a monumental dearth of funding for women's causes, and that's true in the US, and it's true globally. It's only 2% of global aid that makes it to women-focused organizations. It is a fraction, a small, very small fraction of a percent that gets to women who are leading organizations in war. And in contrast to that, women are involved in every social movement. They are very often the leaders of social movements, including the movement of journalism focused on women. And when they lead, they make those movements more inclusive, longer lasting, and more effective. One of the things that I'm focused on right now are the women peace builders of Israel and Palestine. Their story has received very little attention compared to its importance. And the story of peace and civil society overall, compared to the story of the war and the intractability of the war and the bad actors and the very bad things that are happening. So one of the pieces is also women who are leading social movements, leading movements against gender apartheid. They also need a whole lot more support from the global community. They need more support in the US, and we need to support journalists who are telling the stories of women and others who are left out of the news cycle. We've got a couple of folks here who have dedicated their careers as well to promoting stories about women, so welcome you to jump in. And coming back to you all for a last round of questions before we close out our panel for the night.
I hope that our talk was not so boring that's like, oh my God, you just want to get done.
I think we've intimidated them. That's what it is. Yeah, go ahead.
Your monetization model, have you thought about it, like how? Sorry, I'm talking about the monetization model. Have you thought about how you might distinguish, like, I'm trying to find nice language. What's a journalist and what's a social media grifter?
No, absolutely. I think that's really, it's a difficult conversation because it's a sensitive conversation to have with people, but I do think it matters. I mean, I'm sure you've experienced this as well. Like, you know, when you're running a news organization, the uncomfortable truth is that we do have to differentiate between what is a journalist and what is not a journalist, and someone who puts out content that might be very popular and even additive. But you know, from my perspective, like, journalism is a profession, and it is something that people work at. That's a career that you build, and so, you know, you don't have to have gone to a fancy school, and you don't have to have gone to, you know, to do an MA in journalism, but you do have to bring a certain degree of professionalism to your work. And so, from my perspective, that's where platforms that monetize work for journalists really need to differentiate between themselves and social media is essentially, and it's an unpopular thing to say, but gatekeeping. You have to be able to say, well, you would onboard someone who is a reporter. Because journalists, you know, we lose the strength of our work. We lose our credibility if we lose what it is we do as professionals. And so there's a reason why someone would want to work at Zan Times or at the New York Times or at any news organization, not just because you want to get paid for your work, but because you also want to have a certain degree of credibility. You need credentials as a credentialed reporter. And so I think any online monetization platform that's offering journalists access to be able to monetize their work does have to differentiate and does have to say, look, we are here for journalists and our strength is in that level. And it might seem exclusionary to some, but to others, it's actually protecting the reporters.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much. I want to give a shout out. Toadstool Books is here. Jane's book is on the back. Jane, whether you want to do signatures or not, you have to do mine.
Happy to.
So please buy a book. We look forward to chatting with you on the side. And thank you so much, MacDowell and everyone, for being here with us to support these incredible journalists.